Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the hair and glands of the integumentary system. If you haven't watched the first video for the integumentary system, you might want to go back and check that out before you get back here. We're going to dive right in and start talking about hair. And remember that hair has a couple of different functions. The first function is protection. Anywhere where you have hair, you are likely to be protecting the skin that is underneath. We also have sensory functions with the hair. Remember, we talked about the sensory receptors that are in the dermis, and you can see here that you actually have something called a hair root plexus that is wrapping around the root of the hair. As things touch or move the hair, you can feel that because as the hair vibrates, these hair root plexuses are picking up those vibrations and sending those sensations up to your central nervous system. We also have a thermoregulatory function for hair. Humans, not so much because we don't really have that much hair, but as animals, we had lots of hair, and you can actually cause contraction of the erector pili muscle, which will cause the hairs to all sort of stand up on end and trap air in between them. You can warm that air, and that will help insulate the animal. So we have two types of hair, vellus and terminal hair. Vellus hair is very short and fine, and this is what covers the majority of your body before puberty. Once people hit puberty, they tend to have what's called terminal hair, and this is thicker and coarser hair. So this is what you would see on a man that has gone through puberty. His chest hair is much thicker than the very, very fine hair that you might find on a child. The hair shaft is the part of the hair that projects above the skin, and the hair root is the part that goes below the skin into the dermis. And they're associated with a couple different types of glands that we're going to talk about at the end of this video. Now, the very bottom of the hair follicle, or the hair root, is called the hair bulb. So that's this sort of bulbous part right there. And if you were to take this hair bulb and cut it in half, transverse, this is what you would see. So this is the hair cut in a transverse plane. The middle of the hair bulb is the medulla, and this is the area where you have the pigment granules. So the melanocytes produce pigmentation, and those are inside the medulla. A person with darker hair is going to have more melanin, more pigment being produced. A person who doesn't produce a lot of melanin is going to have lighter hair or blonde hair. The cortex surrounds and is on the outside of the medulla. That's the thicker part. Now, a little note on these two words, medulla and cortex. We're going to see those a lot. So make sure you remember medulla is the middle or the inside part, and the cortex is the outside part. You're going to see that in a lot of other structures in the body. Surrounding the outside of the hair shaft is the cuticle. So when you're brushing your hair and you're admiring how shiny and beautiful your hair looks, what you're really looking at are the cells of the cuticle. So this part here is the part, these three layers are the parts that are going to emerge as the hair shaft. Around the hair shaft, when it's still down in the dermis, we have three other layers. We have the internal root sheath, the external root sheath, and then the dermal root sheath. This external root sheath is actually a continuation of the epidermis. So this part right here is going to continue down and surround the entire hair root. All right, let's take a closer look at what's going on and how we actually make new hair. So the very base of the hair root is this hair bulb. The hair root, again, consists of the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. That's the part that you see outside of the skin. The hair follicle part is the part that surrounds the hair root, and that consists of the internal root sheath and the external root sheath, as well as the dermal root sheath. This part right here, external root sheath, that's the one that is a continuation of the epidermis. Now, how do we make new cells? Well, it works very similarly to the epidermis, which kind of makes sense because we have a dividing layer of cells. That's called the hair matrix. Those cells continue to divide and make up all the other cells of the hair root. In order to do that, these cells need a lot of nutrients. The nutrients are brought in by blood vessels into an area that's called the papilla. So the business end of this is the hair matrix, which are the dividing cells, and the papilla, which brings in the nutrients that those cells need to keep dividing. Within the hair matrix, we also have some melanocytes. Those melanocytes produce pigment that is deposited inside the medulla, which is the inner yellow layer of hair of the hair root. As these dividing cells produce more cells, we're going to cause the hair root to grow and start pushing out through the dermis and out through the epidermis and outside of the body. Now, this hair system, the hair root and the hair follicle, are associated with some glands. So the first one is going to be a sebaceous gland. Sebaceous glands secrete sebum, which is secreted out into the neck of the hair follicle. Now, the job of sebum is to moisturize and protect the hair so that it doesn't break off. The tough thing about the sebaceous glands is that if you don't wash your hair often enough, it can start looking very oily, and that's because of these sebaceous glands. So that's our first type of gland we're going to discuss. There's going to be 4. So one is a sebaceous gland. Number 2 is something called a sudoriferous gland. Now, there's 2 types of sudoriferous glands. These are basically sweat glands. So the simplest one is called an eccrine sweat gland. Eccrine sweat glands secrete sweat. Their job is to help in thermoregulation. So they're activated when your body temperature goes up. You secrete sweat. The evaporation of the sweat from your skin helps to dissipate heat, and it brings your body temperature back down. You're going to find eccrine sweat glands on places like your palms, your forehead, your back, any place where you sweat when you're working out. And eccrine sweat consists of water, electrolytes, urea, uric acid, ammonia, and amino acids. So it's got a lot of water, and it's got a lot of salt, and it's got a couple of other waste products in it. Sometimes you can tell that you're sweating. That's called sensible perspiration. So this is when you go to the gym, you're working out, and you have sweat rolling down your back and your face. There's also something called insensible perspiration. And this is when you can't tell that you're sweating. It evaporates before it builds up enough to be perceived as moisture. So this would be if you just are getting a little bit overheated and you're sitting in class, your body will still sweat, but it won't necessarily build up to the point where you have sweat rolling down the back of your neck. So eccrine sweat glands are not associated with a hair follicle. This would be an eccrine sweat gland right here. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see that there's a gland and it does this, and then it has a duct, and that duct leads out to a sweat pore that opens on the surface of the skin. So there's no place in here where this gland is associated with a hair follicle. The other type of sudoriferous gland is associated with a hair follicle, and that's called an apocrine sweat gland. Apocrine sweat glands can be found in the armpits, in the groin, around the areolae of the nipples. These are not associated with thermoregulation. So they're going to secrete sweat, but the sweat is associated with emotional activities and sexual activity. The components of apocrine sweat are the same as eccrine sweat: water, salt, urea, ammonia, some amino acids, but they also include lipids and other proteins, which is why in your armpits and your groin, that sweat tends to be kind of stinky sweat, because there are bacteria that live on your skin that will digest those proteins and digest those lipids and will excrete and secrete things that cause body odor. So eccrine sweat glands are not associated with a hair follicle, but apocrine sweat glands are. And let me draw out. Here's an apocrine sweat gland, and you can see its gland comes up here and it opens in the neck of the hair follicle. So if we're talking about armpits and groins, we're talking about pubic hair or underarm hair that these are associated with. So apocrine, stinky; eccrine, just sweaty, not necessarily a sexual sweat, but just a thermoregulatory sweat. Okay, so sebaceous gland is associated with hair follicle. I'll put that in. Their job is to moisturize and protect that hair so it doesn't break off. Sudoriferous glands, there's two types. One is associated with a hair follicle, one is not. And we also have another type, which is called a ceruminous. So ceruminous glands are in the external ear. So these guys either open directly onto the epithelium in the ear canal, or sometimes they open into the neck of a hair follicle in the ear. And if you take the product of the ceruminous gland plus sebaceous gland in the ear, you add those two things together, and you're going to get something called cerumen. And cerumen is a sticky, waterproof layer of wax, essentially, that's going to protect that external ear and protect the eardrum from water, trap particles, keep out insects, things like that. So it is the secretion of a ceruminous gland plus the secretion of the sebaceous glands, the sebum, that's going to make something called cerumen, which is essentially wax. All right, that is it for today. We've covered, what did we cover? We covered the hair and how the hair is produced, and we talked here, plus the glands that may or may not be associated with the hair follicles. Again, most of them are associated with hair follicles, but those eccrine ones are not. All right, that's it for today. See you in class.